So you watched my last video and you learned how to color correct your footage so that it's neutral and balanced. If not, pause this and go watch that video real quick. Okay, great, so you watched that video, but now you want to learn how to add a bit of pizzazz to your videos. That's where color grading comes in. Join me as we learn some advanced color techniques.
First things first, you want to decide contextually what you want to convey through the grade. We don't just make our images look cool for cool's sake. We try to decide what we want to convey through the grading process. So let's take a look at our shot and see how we can add to this story with our color choices. Now, we have to ask ourselves, what kind of film is this? Is it a drama? Is it a comedy? And also, what is the purpose of this scene? So for our case, let's say that this is a high tension drama. So let's just brainstorm a few words that might come to mind for something like this. For instance, dark, cold, drama, gritty, shadowy. These are all actionable adjectives that we can actually incorporate into the grade. So, all right, enough talk. Let's jump in. This shot was shot in what's called log, which is a very flat image profile with not a lot of contrast or color. This is a really great starting point for us since it gives us the most options and the latitude in our grade. So to get us to a new starting point that's a little less flat, we are going to use a conversion LUT to transform our video from the very flat log to a profile that's got a more standard baseline like Rec. 709, which just adds some more contrast and saturation to your footage to make it look more, quote, normal. The order that you put your nodes in is also really important. Each node affects everything that precedes it. I'm going to put the conversion LUT at the very end since it clamps down our contrast, our dynamic range, and our color. And we want to make sure that all of our adjustments are before that because we'll have access to the most amount of information. So for this one, we're going to set it with a conversion LUT, slog3 to Rec. 709, and we are going to label our node LUT. So as you can see, when we toggle this on and off, it kind of just gets us to a more contrasty place, a little bit less flat, and it's just kind of a nicer starting point for our grade. And just to remind you, all of the adjustments we're going to do are going to be before this LUT. This will be the final node on our node tree. And so the next node that I'm going to add a serial node before, and we're going to name this one exposure. This node is going to be working with the brightness of our image, and to do that I'm going to work with the primary color wheels here. But just to beat a dead horse, there are a lot of different ways to do every adjustment in Resolve. You could use the primary wheels, you could use the HDR wheels, you could use the curves, etc., etc. But for me, personally, primary wheels is the way to go. So for this image, I think it's probably a little too bright right now. We're going to pull down the gain, we're going to pull down the lift a little bit. You know, we're doing a moody drama here, just to remind you, so yeah, I mean, that looks good for now. We're going to come back to that and revisit it in a second. But for now, I think that's good. So the next node we're going to add, we're going to label it contrast. So with contrast, you can just go to the contrast slider here and you can raise and lower the contrast. And you can also use, going over to the waveform to show this, you can use the pivot tool here to adjust where the contrast lies on the exposure. So you can make your image brighter or darker while maintaining the same amount of contrast. So I think we can probably just add a little bit of contrast, maybe kind of brighten it up just a hair. This is another adjustment that we're probably going to come back to and revisit it once we get further into the grade. So next up, we're going to add another node, a serial node, and this is going to be saturation. And just a reminder to make a new node for every adjustment and to label every node. It might take a couple more seconds in the process, but it'll end up saving you a lot of time and headache in the long run. So this saturation, I'm probably going to lower it just a little bit. Again, we'll probably come back to all of these and kind of make slight adjustments as we kind of get further along. But for right now, I think that looks pretty good. And a little tip here that I like to use for saturation is you go into the curves wheel and you go to the saturation versus saturation panel. And what you do is you just isolate the lower half of the image here, the blacks and the shadows, and you just lower the contrast on that. You don't have to go all the way down because that takes out, a good portion of the color. But if you just lower the saturation on, the blacks of your image, basically, it kind of gives it this really nice, quote, filmic look. And you don't have to do much, but I think it just kind of adds a nice cinematic touch to the image. So next, let's talk about power windows. With power windows, you can select certain parts of the image and make adjustments to just that area. So in this shot, let's say that we want to lower the exposure on these ceiling tiles here. So the next node we're going to add, and we are going to call this, let's call it ceiling. So to make a power window, you go into the window panel here, and we are going to make a square one. So what you do is you just take the power window and you just choose the area that you want to work with. For us, it's going to be these ceiling panels here. And what you can do is go down to this red dot when the little pen tool appears and just feather the window out so that it's not quite so harsh and drastic. So now we have this little part of the image selected. And if you want to see which part of the image you're working with, you can go up here to the little magic wand highlight tool and click it. And this shows you, okay, so this is the part of the image that you're working with. The rest of it, down here is not going to be affected by this power window. So we can go back into our wheels and we can turn the brightness down on the ceiling just a little bit. And then we can go back to our node and toggle it on and off. And as you can see, it just made our ceiling a little bit darker. Maybe a little too dark. I'm gonna just move that off a little bit. Power windows are super powerful. You can do as many different power windows as you want. You can just highlight certain parts of the image. You can isolate just your character to make adjustments. Really, the sky is the limit. So we know how to do power windows, but what if we want to get more granular and we want to just isolate specifically, say, the skin tone of our character without affecting all the stuff around it that might happen in a window? See, if you go to do a window and you want to just do the character's skin, you want to get it as close as possible, but we're still going to get a little bit of the shirt, we're going to get a little bit of the background, and we don't want that. So what you can do is you create a new node. We're going to label this one skin. And what we can do is go to the qualifier panel here. And when you do that, what's going to pop up is a little eyedropper in the viewer. And you go to the skin and just choose it. And go back to the highlight tool. And then you can see what it's choosing. There's a lot of different parts of the image that are being affected by this. So you can go down here and just refine it, play around with the sliders, see how you can get it to be just the skin, play with the softness panels. Really, just like a lot of these things, you just kind of got to play around with the sliders and see what works best. So we're getting getting a pretty good selection of his skin here, but if you want to get it even more specific than this, you can stack a power window on top of the qualifier. So to do that, in the same node, we're going to just make another window. I'm going to use a circular one, and like we did before, we're just going to kind of make it so that it's just around his skin. So now you can see basically we're just selecting his skin tone without all the other stuff that was the same color around it. So when we get out of here, we can go back to our wheels and say we wanted to boost the saturation around his skin, just to give him a little bit more color. And then to see what we're doing here, we can disable that node. And it's doing just, a little bit, a little subtle pop. We can do some other things. We can add a little bit of more detail. If we wanted to change the temperature of his skin, we can make it a little cooler. Really we're just kind of making very small adjustments, which is generally what you want to do. You don't want to go too overboard because often less is more. So we can just turn up the highlights a little bit. You can really do whatever you want, whatever you think looks good. I think for now that is good. So then when you go to the power window here, you'll notice that in the scene there's some slight camera movements, the character moves around a little bit, but the power window just stays there. So what you want to do in the power window is, since we're at the end of the clip here, we're going to go to the tracker window and we're going to track reverse. And when you do that, Resolve interprets all the movement and it follows the character. So the power window stays directly on the character the whole time. So, you don't have to have a tripod and a totally static shot. Resolve is powerful enough to be able to interpret the movement and have the adjustments follow. So now we have a really good track on his skin. It's super precise, and if we wanted to come back later, we can make more adjustments. So it's good to just have a nice tracked skin tone. That way, later on, you can come back and make whatever adjustments you need to make. So once you start doing a lot of different adjustments, your node tree is going to maybe look a little chaotic and unorganized. And so if you just right click in here, you can go to cleanup node graph, and then it gives you a nice streamlined, clean node tree, which is what we like to see. Quick coffee break. Okay, so in the last tutorial, we learned how to make our image a neutral baseline. But now we're color grading. So we want to add some emotion to our image here. In the beginning, we brainstormed some adjectives to apply to our grade. I think it was dark, cold, drama, gritty, shadowy. So now when we move into the color grading portion of this, we can really start to implement some of those into our image. So we are going to add a new node. And I will do that after the color node. Like I said, the node tree order is very important, and it's a little bit more complicated than I can get into in a real short overview video, but there's a lot of good resources online, including Blackmagic's own videos about this. So definitely go check those out and learn more about the importance of order in your node tree. So, okay, like we said, dark, cold. So I'm thinking we might want to cool the image down a little bit. We can make the temperature a little blue. We can add a little bit of green. You can already sort of see that it's already looking a bit more dramatic. You really don't need to do too much to it to make it look good. You don't need to go all the way full blue. Especially when we desaturated our image a little bit. Adding just a little bit of coolness to the image goes a really, really long way. So I think this is already looking pretty good. And then, you can see when you start messing around with the color, his skin tone changes. And maybe we don't want that, but since we already have the skin tone mapped, we can go here and, we can reset it. We can make him a little bit warmer, just so that he stands a little bit in contrast to the environment around him. Again, that's just a subtle way you can tell the story a little bit through the grade. It doesn't have to be too obvious or crazy, but it's just a nice little subtle way to push the story forward through the grading. So that looks pretty good. You could kind of play around a little bit more. You could go into here. You could, warm up the shadows a little bit. give it a little bit more coolness, and a little bit of, you know, green tint, but you really don't need to do too much. I think a lot of times people go a little bit overboard and are a little bit heavy-handed with the color part of their grade, but I think that subtlety can be really powerful, and I think that when you do just a little bit, it really does go a long way. I know that I've said that now 5 times, but it's true. This is looking pretty good, but we might come back to it later to make a few adjustments, but let's move on to the next adjustment, which will be to soften the image up a little bit. I think sometimes people think digital video is a little bit too clinical and clean and not really like cinematic. And one way to counteract that is to kind of just soften your image up just a touch. So in order to do that, we're gonna add a node. We're gonna add this after the skin tone, but before the LUT. So this one's gonna be called soft. So in order to soften up, we're gonna go into the curves panel, and we're gonna go in here to the custom or the main panel. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna play around with the soft clip part of the menu here, the low soft and the high soft. And when you adjust this, you can see that it's really, really subtle, but it just kind of softens up the highlights and the shadows. It's very, very subtle, but I think that it kind of adds just a nice little bit of roll off to your image. It kind of blunts some of that kind of clinical harshness that people complain about sometimes. And as you can see, when you disable it and enable it, it might help to zoom in a little bit. But it's almost imperceptible. But see, if you pump it all the way up, you can kind of see it's just, I'm probably not going to do that much, but it's just kind of softening the edges up a little bit. It's very, very subtle, but I think that it does kind of add a sort of imperceptible non-digital look to your footage. So another thing along the same lines is we can add a new node, and we can call this one glow. Let's clean up our node graph a little bit here. So with glow, we're going to go into the effects panel, and we're just going to search for glow, and we're going to put the effect on that node. And this, as you can see, just with the default, it kind of just makes your highlights bloom out a little bit, kind of adds a little bit of almost chromatic aberration. And with this, you know, you can really just play around and see what you think looks good. I think if you overdo this, you know, it's going to look like your character is in heaven or something, which, you know, depending on what your story is, might work for you. But you just want to play around a little bit, and you know, you can, that's kind of interesting. Really, all of these adjustments, there's really no kind of rules. You can kind of just go around and move sliders around and see what you think looks good. I tend to sort of be a little bit more conservative in a lot of these things, but you know, if you want to bloom them all out, I say go for it. I'm not going to really do too much with that. I think that's looking pretty good. Just a little touch of kind of softness, a little bit of halation in the highlights, kind of bloom out those windows a little bit. I think that adds just kind of a nice little touch. So the final adjustment that we're going to do is we are going to add some nice film grain that everybody loves. Resolve has a really nice film grain effect built in, so you don't have to go out and buy any expensive film grain packs on the internet. Resolve already has you covered. So in our new node labeled grain, we're going to go in here. You can use really any of these you want, and I think you just kind of have to play around and just see what the different ones do. For me personally, I kind of like the 35mm ones, The 400T is kind of nice. If you want to, sometimes it can be kind of hard to see what's going on even if you toggle it on and off. But if you go and choose the grain only, it will show you what is happening with the grain. So see, this is what is being overlaid on your image. So, you know, if you want to make the texture really big, you could do that. If you want to change the grain size, that might look a little wild, but, you know, this will just kind of give you a good view of what the grain is doing exactly before you come back to your image. And so you can kind of just see the grain doing its thing here. That's almost a little bit too much for my taste, but I think it actually looks kind of cool. It gives our image some nice texture, and it's pretty subtle. You know, you can kind of just see on the walls there, it just adds a little bit of nice little rustication in our image, if you will. And so now we kind of have our kind of lay of the land set out here. And now what we can do is we can just go back and we can adjust these things. We can go to the skin tones. For me, this color is a little bit not exactly where I would want it to be. And you just play around. I'm gonna, you know, bring up the brightness just a little bit. You can also go, another tool that's good to know is the color warper tool, which allows you to change the saturation, the hue, and the luminance of specific colors in your image. So for instance, you know, his skin is pretty warm, pretty orange. You can kind of see when you hover over it, this is where it's represented on the color warper, kind of in there, which if you want to, you know, access more little points on the graph, you can add, you know, different matrices to it and see it's just targeting the orange on his skin basically. And so if you wanted more saturation, you could pull it out. If you wanted a little less, you could just kind of pull it down a little bit. You could nudge it more towards pink or more towards green. For me, I just want to kind of nudge the saturation down just a touch. So these are all pretty simple adjustments, but they really just add to the overall picture here. And so, yeah, you can just kind of go in. We can maybe just adjust this a little bit, just the brightness of our image a little bit. We'll give it maybe just a touch more contrast here. And like I said, you know, I've been using the primary color wheels, but you could go into the curves, and if you wanted to add more contrast, you could just kind of make a little S curve. That looks horrible, but you know, you get the point. I might just raise the black level just a touch. Might come down on the whites. That just lowers the contrast a little bit. But yeah, overall, I'm really liking the way that this image is looking. And if you want to bypass the whole grade and just see what it was originally, you can click that, click it on, click it off, and you can see, you know, we've come a pretty long way. This is where we started, and this is where we are now. We have a nice kind of blue, green, cool, gritty aesthetic like we were going for. And if you want to just see what we did with the color, this is kind of the, you know, I guess normal color. And then, you know, we really added a nice kind of cool aesthetic here. So our character looks properly gritty and dark. So again, if you want to just see where we started and toggle it on and off, you can admire all the hard work that we've done. And just to review, here is a graph of all the nodes and the various adjustments I made in each of them. Again, when you color an image, you don't need to follow this exact same prescription or these same nodes or even the same order if you want. I would highly recommend that you kind of find what you like, take, which tools of these you think works and adjust it and suit it to your own needs. That's what's great about Resolve and about color grading in general, is that, it's really open for interpretation. If you wanted to make this image, warmer instead of this kind of cooler image, you could do that, and it would change the kind of aesthetic of the movie a little bit. It would look like that instead of what we came out with. And that's great. And I highly encourage people to experiment and to try things and to just find what works for you. So once again, these are all the things that we did. If you wanted to just kind of see what each node is doing, you could go and just toggle on each different one, toggle it on and off. To do that, I'm just hitting Command D. And you can see that it is very helpful to have different nodes for every adjustment. That way you can go back and you can say, I want to see what it looks like without the grain. And if you did it all in one node, that would be significantly more difficult. So thank you so much for watching this video. I hope that you found these tips helpful. If you have any other suggestions or tips that you have, feel free to leave them down in the comments below. My name is Dean from B&H, and I will see you next time.